Hello, students. A very fresh and beautiful morning to all of you. I hope you all are in good health and taking great care of yourself. Welcome back to our English class. As you know, students, that we are done with section 1 of unit 6, that is what Lucy found there, right? And the second unit, we are not going to have it for term 2 syllabus. So we would be doing directly section 3, the listeners. And I know in the previous video we have done half of our worksheet of worksheet 6, right? So the remaining half we would be doing tomorrow in our live class, and today I am sending you the video related to section 3, that is the poem The Listeners, written by Walter de la Mare. Walter John de la Mare was born in 1873 and died in 1956, was an English poet, short story writer, and a novelist. He is best remembered for his works for children and for his poem, The Listeners. His 1921 novel, Memoirs of a Midget, won the James State Black Memorial Prize for Fiction. His post-war collected stories for children won 1947 Carnegie Medal for British Children's Book. So this was little bit information about Walter John de la Mare, the poet of this poem. So now let's just recite the poem before we move ahead with the explanation and its summary. So I request you students to read along. "Is there anybody there?" said the traveller, knocking on the moonlight door, and his horse in the silence champed the grasses of the forest's ferny floor. And a bird flew up out to the turret above the traveller's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. "Is anybody there?" he said, but no one descended to the traveller. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, when he stood perplexed and still. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men, stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved, cropping the dark turf beneath the starred and leafy sky. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. "Tell them I came and no one answered, that I kept my word," he said. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house from the one man left awake. Ay, they heard his foot upon the stirrup and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. So students, the poem Listeners has a mysterious and supernatural touch with the mention of phantoms, that means ghost, and that might be the listeners because the query of traveler goes unanswered. That means when a traveler comes over there and knocks the door, the only person who might listen to him are the ghost. The poem tells the story of an unnamed traveler approaching an abandoned house, seemingly inhabited by ghosts, but leaves the reader many questions as to who these entities actually are unanswered. Okay, so let's just understand the poem stanza wise. So let's see the first stanza. Is there anybody there? Said the traveler, knocking on the moonlit door. So, an unknown figure you can say or unnamed, जिसको यहाँ पे सिर्फ नाम दिया गया है traveler, right? He knocked at the door in the moonlight, okay? When the moon was shining at that time, and the moonlit door, that means the only uh, light which fell on the door was that of moon, right? So he went over there and knocked at the door and said, is anybody there? And his horse in the silence champed the grasses of the forest ferny floor. So while he was knocking at the door, his horse on which he came over there, right? It was chewing and making sounds, and he was eating the grass which was there on the forest ferny floor. Ferny floor means on the floor of the forest soil जहाँ पे छोटे छोटे plants grow होते हैं, ठीक है? The fern plants that grow on the forest soil. So when the traveler was knocking at the door, moonlit door, and when he asked, is anybody there? What did the horse do? The horse in the silence. Why it is said it is silent? Because he went all through the woods, मतलब forest के through गया है वो, और कोई नहीं है वहाँ पे. That's why it was quite silent. और वहाँ पे जो आवाज़ आ रही थी अभी हाल फिलहाल, वो किसकी आ रही थी? Only of that horse who was chewing and eating the grass which was there on the forest floor. And a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveler's head. And suddenly a bird flew up out of the turret. Turret means, it's written over here, what does it mean? Small tower that projects from the wall of a building. It's a kind of small tower that comes out of the wall of a building. That means वहाँ पे जो castle है उसके ऊपर एक cylindrical tower जो है वो rise हुआ है. That is called turret. So a small bird flew up out of the turret. And it went over the traveler's head. That means it flew up above the traveler's head. And he smote upon the door again a second time. Is there anybody there? He said. That means once again he knocked loudly. I'm very sorry, students. Here you can see the meaning. Smote means to knock loudly. So once he said, nobody answered. Then he again smote upon the door for the second time. That means he knocked the door loudly again and said, is anybody there? But no one descended to the traveler. So no one descended from the to the traveler. That means descended means came down and opened the door for the traveler. That means no one listened to his cry, and no head from the leaf fringed sill leaned out over and looked into his grey eyes. No head means not a single human being. So not a single human being came over near the window, okay, and they leaned over. That means not a single of them came over and leaned out of the window to look who is knocking the door. Nobody came over there and looked into his grey eyes where he stood perplexed and still. That means he was standing there confused. Perplexed means confused. He didn't know what to do because nobody was ready to answer him. He was standing there still and confused. But nobody came down from the castle, or nobody came to him, and not a single person was there in the house who would just lean over the window leaf fringed sill. That means a plant whose leaves are reaching towards the windowsill. Okay, so not a single person was leaning outside to see who is knocking at the door, but the traveler stood over there still and confused. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to the voice from the world of men. So, here the phantom listeners, that means the ghosts who were living over there, those are the host, that means those are the owner of the house that dwelt in the lone house. Dwelt means to live. So, only the beings who were living over there, right? कौन रह रहा था वहाँ पे? सिर्फ घोस्ट रह रहे थे, उनके अलावा वहाँ पे कोई भी नहीं था. Okay, in the lone house then, what did they do when they heard that voice? When they heard that voice from the world of men, that means human being. A traveler was a human being, and that's why it is said to the voice of the world of men. So the phantom listeners who were living in that house listened to that voice, and they stood over there listening in the quiet of the moonlight. So they just kept on listening when the traveler was knocking at the door and asking if anybody is there. Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall. That means all the phantom listeners, that means all the ghosts who were listening to the traveler, they were standing in a crowd on the stairs जहाँ पे moon की light गिर रही थी. Okay, the faint moonlight was falling on that stair. And what was that stair leading to? The stair was leading towards the empty hall. As nobody was living over there, इसीलिए वो हॉल कैसा था? पूरा एम्प्टी था. और वो जो एम्प्टी हॉल था, राइट, उसके अंदर किसका आवाज़ गूंज रहा था? द ओनली वॉइस विच वॉज बींग heard over there in that quiet atmosphere was that of the traveler. Okay, so that goes down the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveler's call. So the ghost was standing in a crowd on the stairs which led to an empty hall. They were listening attentively. Hearkening means they were listening attentively to the traveler's call in an air stirred and shaken by lonely traveler's call. That means जो वहाँ का एटमोसफियर था, राइट, जो हाउस का एटमोसफियर था वो काफ़ी क्वाइट था, और उसके अंदर किस चीज़ का वाइब्रेशन आ रहा था, या वो जो वहाँ की एयर थी वो किस चीज़ से शेक हो रही थी? बिकॉज ऑफ द ट्रैवलर्स call. Yeah, you can say because of the traveler's voice. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved, cropping the dark turf neath the starred and leafy sky. And he felt his heart's their strangeness. That means the traveler felt that there is somebody present inside the house. He could sense that thing, that there is someone who is inside, and Diya stillness answering his cry. That means stillness means stable, or you can say they were not at all moving, right? The ghosts were not moving, लेकिन उनका जो प्रेजेंस था वो ट्रैवलर को फील हो रहा था. उसको लग रहा था कि दिया स्टिलनेस वॉज आंसरिंग हिज क्राई. दैट मीन्स that although they are not moving, but they are still listening to him. While his horse moved, cropping the dark turf. Neath the starred and leafy sky. So he was able to hear, he was able to sense that presence of those ghosts when his horse moved over there on that forest floor, cropping the dark turf. That means he was trying to eat that fern plants which were over there on the forest soil. Neath the starred and leafy sky. Neath means beneath. Okay. The starred and leafy sky. Starred means the sky full of stars. Sorry. And the leafy sky. Leafy sky, why does it say so? That because the reflection of the sky was such, when you see from under the trees, जो मून की लाइट गिर रही है उस वजह से जो स्काई का इमेज बनता है, राइट? या फिर आप जैसे ट्रीज़ के नीचे खड़े रह के अगर देखते हो तो मून की लाइट आ रही है, तो किसके बीच से आ रही है? लीफ के बीच बीच से आ रही है, राइट? एंड दैट्स वाई दे हैव कॉल्ड इट एज अ लीफी स्काई. So the traveler was able to sense the presence of somebody inside the house who was not at all moving, who were not ready to come and meet to him, but yes, he know that there is somebody who is answering his cry. That means there is someone who is listening to him, right? And at that time his horse was just cropping the dark turf underneath the starred and leafy sky. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. And then he suddenly smote the door. That means he again knocked at the door, and this time even loudly. मतलब पहले नॉक किया था उससे भी ज़्यादा ज़ोर से उसने डोर के ऊपर नॉक किया. And then he lifted his head as if he was trying to announce something. और उसका announcement क्या था कि tell them I came and no one answered. That I kept my word, he said. That means he was letting the ghost or the listeners, right? हमको अभी मालूम नहीं है कि अंदर listeners के फॉर्म में सिर्फ घोस्ट ही थे या फिर कोई ह्यूमन बींग भी था अंदर, राइट? सो ही सेड दैट प्लीज़ लेट देम नो कि मैं यहाँ पे आया था एंड नो वन आंसर्ड मी एंड आई केप्ट माई वर्ड. दैट मीन्स आई केप्ट माई प्रॉमिस. सो प्लीज़ let them know, those who are listening, those who are there in the house, please let them know that I kept my word. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house from the one man left awake. That means even after he spoke so loudly, there was not a single stir. That means there was not a single movement made by the listeners. Even though each and every word that he spake means over here spoke. Each and every word that he spoke, it felt like it was echoing through the shadowiness of the still house. Shadowiness means the darkness which was created by the shadow of that हाउस. और ऐसा लग रहा था कि उस शैडो के अंदर या फिर उस डार्कनेस के अंदर उसका हर एक वर्ड एको हो रहा था, राइट? और वो वर्ड किसके थ्रू आया था? फ्रॉम द वन मैन लेफ्ट अवेक. दैट मीन्स The only person who was awake, or you can say the only person who was living, that was the traveler. Okay. So from the one man left awake, that means the traveler, the unnamed person over here, वही एक आदमी था जो जाग रहा था, और यू कैन से हु वॉज लिविंग, और उसने बोला गया हर एक वर्ड, द ईच एंड एवरी वर्ड दैट ही स्पोक वॉज echoing through the shadowiness of the still house, but still not a single listener moved, or not a single listener came outside. Okay. Hey, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of the iron on stone. And then they heard his foot upon the stirrup. Stirrup means a loop or a ring hung from either side of the horse's saddle to support the rider's feet. That means a loop kind of thing, जिसके ऊपर पैर रख के उसका जो राइडर होता है वो हॉर्स के ऊपर चढ़ जाता है, राइट. सो दे कुड हियर हिज फुट बीइंग प्लेस्ड ऑन दैट स्टरअप. ठीक है, जो लिसनर्स थे उन्होंने सुना कि उसने अपना फुट रखा वो स्टरअप के ऊपर. एंड दे हर्ड द साउंड ऑफ आयरन ऑन द स्टोन. दैट मीन्स द साउंड ऑफ हॉर्स गैलोपिंग. ओके, नाउ आयरन क्यों लिखा गया है? बिकॉज ऑफ द हॉर्स शू नेल, राइट. आपको पता होगा हॉर्स शू नेल होता है जो उनके पैर में लगा होता है, राइट, हूफ के अंदर. एंड दैट वॉज मेकिंग द साउंड, एंड दैट वॉज द आयरन विच वॉज मेकिंग द साउंड व्हेन इट वॉज गैलोपिंग, राइट. जब वो गैलोप कर रहा था हॉर्स, तब उसका जो आयरन नेल था उसकी वजह से आवाज़ हो रहा था जब वो स्टोन के ऊपर पैर रखता है. एंड हाउ द साइलेंस सर्ज्ड softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. And as the traveler just climbed up the horse, and the sound of iron stone, that means जैसे ही हॉर्स ने गैलोप करना चालू किया वैसे ही जो फॉरेस्ट का साइलेंस था, राइट, या फिर वहाँ पे जो कोई नहीं था उसकी वजह से जो साइलेंस था, दैट सर्ज्ड. Surged means moved like advancing waves, or you can also say rised up. The silence was rising back up, right, when the plunging hoofs were gone. Plunging means jumping. That means जैसे जैसे हॉर्स का जो हूफ है उसका जो आवाज़ हो रहा था, राइट, द फोर्सफुल राइडिंग, जैसे जैसे हॉर्स मूव होके जा रहा था, वहाँ से दूर जा रहा था, राइट, हाउस से, तो उस वक्त जो वहाँ की साइलेंस थी वो वापस धीरे धीरे बढ़ने लगी. ओके, सो स्टूडेंट्स, आई होप दैट यू अंडरस्टूड दिस पोएम, एंड इफ़ यू हैव एनी डाउट रिलेटेड टू इट, यू कैन आस्क मी टुमारो इन द लाइव क्लास.